Imagine being completely, utterly trapped. Picture yourself locked behind thick, impenetrable prison walls, totally surrounded by heavily armed guards, or stuck deep behind hostile enemy lines. For most of us, right, those scenarios are just the end of the road. We look at those massive barriers and totally accept that escape is impossible. But as we're going to explore in today's explainer, history is actually punctuated by a few extraordinary individuals who just refused to accept those boundaries. They literally achieved what absolutely no one thought could be done. So today we're unpacking the architecture of freedom, breaking down the greatest, most daring escapes that absolutely shocked the world. Okay, let's dive into this. When you are staring down a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, what exactly does it take to defy the odds? That is the core mystery we're trying to solve today. What's the formula for human ingenuity when the desperate drive for freedom completely overrides the reality of being confined? To really understand this, we need to look at how totally different environments force people to engineer wildly different strategies just to survive. For this explainer, we'll be breaking down these historical events into three distinct types of traps: enemy territory, prison walls, and political borders. Section 1: Escaping behind enemy lines. The sheer impossibility of hostile territory. You see, hostile territory is unique because there isn't just one wall to climb. The entire landscape is actively working against you. If you break out of a compound, your journey has literally just begun. Every single person you meet and every mile you cross is a potential threat. A perfect example of this is a name you definitely know, but maybe not for this specific reason. Way before he was Britain's famous wartime leader, Winston Churchill was actually captured. During the Second Boer War in South Africa, he was held in a POW camp, but he planned a super daring escape under the cover of darkness. Churchill actually scaled the camp wall, but like we said, the wall was just step one. He then had to flee completely alone, navigating for days across hostile territory with barely any food or water. He ended up traveling over 100 kilometers across this brutal landscape. Before reaching safety, it was actually this crazy solo escape that first made him a national hero in Britain. Let's move to and see how this builds when we scale things way up. Churchill was just one guy, right? But during World War II, hundreds of Allied airmen were locked up in a heavily guarded German POW camp called Stalag Luft III. Instead of giving up, these prisoners worked together to pull off an unbelievably complex escape plan. Step 1: secretly digging 3 massive tunnels, which they famously code-named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Step 2 was just logistical genius. Using only homemade tools, they systematically removed literally tons of sand from under without the guards ever noticing. It's wild, and it all led to Step 3, the massive daring nighttime breakout on March 24th, 1944. And all that intense collaboration leads us to this jaw-dropping number 76. On that night, 76 prisoners managed to successfully squeeze through Tunnel Harry and escape. Now, the historical records do show that most of these men were eventually recaptured by enemy forces, but the sheer scale and absolute audacity of the operation cemented it as one of the boldest prison break attempts in human history. It went on to inspire countless books and movies for a reason. Section 2: Breaking the ultimate prison. Defeating the impossible fortress. Alright, we transition now from wartime to camps, a civilian structure that was designed specifically to be inescapable. Alcatraz, it was universally known as America's most secure prison. Officials boldly guaranteed that escaping was impossible, mostly because the whole place was surrounded by the treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. But in 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin decided to test that theory. Their plan was so incredibly meticulous. First, for months, they secretly widened the ventilation openings in their cells using just super basic homemade tools. Second, knowing the water was the real trap, they painstakingly glued and stitched together an inflatable raft out of stolen raincoats. And third, to buy themselves a head start, they crafted these scarily realistic dummy heads and tucked them into their beds to fool the night guards. And then one stormy night, they slipped through the vents and were gone. Which leaves us with a massive haunting question. Did they actually survive those icy waters? After they vanished, authorities launched one of the biggest manhunts in American history. But despite all the resources they poured into it, absolutely no one knows for sure if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived the bay. To this very day, it remains a totally unsolved mystery. Section 3: Fleeing oppressive political regimes. Navigating borders and divisions. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how entirely different these scenarios are. These people aren't PWs or convicted criminals in a maximum security block. They're just individuals trapped by political tensions, where national borders suddenly turned into highly restricted, dangerous zones. Escaping here means navigating massive geographical and ideological divides. We can see a really stark contrast in how people handled this. On one hand, you have solitary evasion, a highly targeted, singular effort relying on deep disguise and harsh natural terrain. And on the other, you have grassroots methods, collective, highly experimental approaches by everyday citizens, taking on a massive urban barricade. Let's look a little closer at both of these historically significant events, looking first at solitary evasion. Back in 1959, political tensions in Tibet reached a total breaking point. Fearing for his safety during the unrest, the 14th Dalai Lama orchestrated a highly secretive escape from Lhasa. To avoid being spotted, he completely disguised himself as an ordinary soldier. He traveled strictly by night, picking his way through incredibly dangerous mountain passes. It was a grueling, terrifying journey that took nearly 2 weeks before he finally made it safely into India. This single calculated evasion fundamentally shifted the course of Tibetan history and stands as one of the most significant political escapes of the 20th century. On the other side of our comparison, we have the Berlin Wall. For almost 3 decades, this wall physically divided families, friends, and entire nation. The political tension literally split a city in half. Over those 30 years, thousands of people tried to escape from East to West Berlin. And because the barrier was so huge and heavily guarded, people got unbelievably creative. Some citizens dug complex tunnels completely underneath the wall. Others took enormous gambles by hiding inside secretly modified cars to slip through checkpoints. And a few even went so far as to build homemade hot air balloons to fly right over the border. No way, right? But many actually succeeded despite the enormous risks. And these daring escapes became these powerful global symbols of the human desire for freedom. Section for the architecture of hope. The universal blueprint for freedom. So the crucial point is what actually ties all these wild, disparate events together. We've talked about war heroes, prison inmates, spiritual leaders, and everyday citizens. Their environments were completely different, but their internal frameworks exactly the same. Every single one of these incredible historical records shares these core traits: careful planning, courage, determination, and hope. These people faced genuinely overwhelming, staggering odds. The officials said it was impossible. The geography itself said it was impossible. But they just flat out refused to accept that it couldn't be done. It's a brilliant illustration of how human ingenuity just ignites when we are pushed to our absolute limits. Ultimately, history is full of these remarkable escapes because they test the absolute limits of our courage. Whether fleeing a heavily guarded prison, escaping a war zone, or crossing restricted political borders, they demonstrate extraordinary determination. And they leave us with this powerful takeaway. Their journeys remind us that even in the darkest moments, hope can survive. These aren't just cool stories about breaking out of physical places. They're enduring testaments to the human spirit that continue to inspire millions of people today. We've seen how ordinary people and historical figures alike built their own architecture of freedom using nothing but homemade tools, stolen raincoats, clever disguises, and an unto-tally, unbreakable will. So I want to leave you with this thought. When you are faced with seemingly insurmountable walls or totally overwhelming odds in your own life, where will you find your hope? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. And keep questioning the impossible.